And we're live.
Hello. Welcome to the Footnotes podcast. This is episode 16. Wow, we've been doing this for 4 months at the very latest. That's great. That's impressive. There's very few things that I've done for 4 months in a row outside of school, I guess. But happy to be here as always. So last week, June, you switched it up a bit and you asked me how my week was been, but I'm going to switch that right back. I didn't like you putting me into that uncomfortable zone, and so I'm going to ask you again. What's good, man? What's been happening?
You know what? I totally expected that this would happen and that you would flip this back on me. So I am prepared. It's been a long week, I think. Lots of ups, lots of downs. So the main thing that's going on in my life right now is that we're transitioning into a new unit, a new block of learning. So we're in medical foundations 2, where we go over the digestive system. So we've been put into new learning groups, and there's been a lot of adjustments that I've had to deal with because of that. And I guess I can just start us off with the story. So I think on Wednesday night, we had a group learning session. We call it tutorials from 7 to 10 p.m., so fairly late. And it wasn't one of my better performances, let's say, in a group setting. I felt as though my research content was lacking. I felt as though everyone else, the 7 other group members, all knew so much more and had so much more to contribute. I felt as though maybe as a result, my opinions or thoughts or questions weren't getting across as much. And so there's this constant perceived negative feedback that I was exposed to during the whole process. And then from the hospital, it's like a 10-minute walk to the bus stop, and it was very cold, and I was sort of underdressed. So I was cold and thinking about the feedback that I received during that session. Yeah. And on my bus ride back home, and my home is very far, or considerably further than most other people, at least in Hamilton. I was feeling very down. I was feeling very depressed. I was noticing that I was getting into this very self-critical and isolating thought loops. So I would say that went on for 2.5 hours or something along that time. So maybe starting from 9 to 11-ish. And then at some point, I was thinking about what to do. I'm feeling this way. How do I respond? Because although I haven't been in this place for a fairly long time, I would say maybe a month or so, or a month or two, I really didn't want to get back into it because I know how horrible and self-defeating it is. So after, one of my coping mechanisms is to eat literally peanut butter and whipped cream. That's kind of like
Just?
keto version of ice cream for me.
Oh, that sounds great, June.
So that's what I did. And I did the absolute bare minimum in terms of hygiene. So I brushed my teeth and I washed my face. And then I kind of laid in my bed, and then I got my laptop out. And then I remembered the kind of fuck you principle that I picked up a few weeks ago. And then I wrote something. So I wanted to share that with you and the audience.
I hope this is like a piece of poetry or something, June. I know you're quite the writer, quite prolific.
Maybe we'll see if it comes across as poetry or rambling.
Okay, let's hear it.
So December 12th, it's called Depression. Welcome back, old friend. I've been wondering where you were. As much as I love hosting guests, I'm afraid you can't stay here for long this time. I know why you're here. It's been getting cold and days have been getting shorter. You've had big changes in the way you study, socialize, and you've been comparing yourself more and more to other people lately. I know, lots of big changes, lots of blows to your confidence, sense of self, and a lot of uncertainty about who you want to become. I get it. You used to come visit me at similar junctions in my life and push me down, bully me into submission, those incessant thought spirals that sound like, why are you hitting yourself? Why are you hitting yourself? Why are you hitting yourself? But this time, that's not going to happen. I promised that I'd take damn great care of myself, that I won't fall victim to your usual tricks. I've learned to recognize when you're sneaking up on me, when you get me fatigued, more self-critical, and create an illusion of disconnection and isolation. I can see through those spells now. I'm not having it anymore because no human being should live under this kind of madness. I have faith in myself, in my own brilliance, and in my capacity to lead the kind of life I want to lead, to become a fully realized individual in this world. So I'm going to choose regular sleep. I'm going to choose nourishment and hygiene. I'm choosing to learn and engaging in the things that make me feel most alive. I'm choosing a different path. So fuck off depression, pack your bags, and get out of here. Until next time, June. That was my fuck you letter to a depressive episode. And at least for the day, for the night, it really helped me cope and come to terms with it.
Thanks for sharing. I know like this is something that you've been grappling with for quite a while. And I know that like you've told me about spells where you've had hours and hours or even days where you've gone without, let's say, like proper hygiene or proper sleep, proper eating and things like that. So what do you think has really changed in the past, let's say, couple of years where you've been able to, I guess, better recognize when you're in a worse place and now take some action like this where you're able to better cope?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. The first thing is just sheer experience. At this point, I feel like almost a little bit of a pro. You know,
You're pro at depression.
Yeah, I'm pro at depression, and I'm sure, many other people are much more experienced than I am. But I've kind of learned to recognize the state over the years, and it has a pattern to it. And now when I see it after years of experiencing this kind of state, and reflecting on and seeing how self-defeating and useless of an adaptation it is, I've learned to recognize it and to direct my attention towards reversing it, because I think one of the things I've learned is that you can start to dip into those depressive, negative, self-enforcing thought spirals, but if you catch it early enough, then you can kind of whip yourself out of it. So that's the first thing, just having years and years of experience of periodic bouts of depression, and like I kind of mentioned in the story and the writing, I know the cues, I know the environmental factors that would lead me to feeling these ways. And when you have a combination of some of them, which synergize very well, like cold weather, shorter days, new environment, a challenging situation, and like lack of self-confidence, yeah, like that's 99% reliably going to produce depressive symptoms. I know that. So that kind of learning has been the first thing. The second thing is, I think I've designed my life so far so that I can have the flexibility, the wiggle room, so that if something like this happens, I can be like, all right, June, I'm allowed to rest and maybe not be okay for 4 or 5 hours. I would rather you do that than spend maybe 4 or 5 days in just kind of mulling over a kind of like a simmering kind of depression,
Right.
right? Whereas I know that if I give myself the space and time to kind of engage with those emotions and to experience them, however long it takes, and then to reconcile with them and move forwards, that the total amount of time that I'm going to spend in this state and the total misery that I have to go through is going to be much less. So yeah, just off the top of my head, those kind of two things.
You know, one of the things that I find really fascinating about depression and the issues surrounding depression is just how prevalent it is and how also recurrent it is. You know, like I also struggled with a lot of those issues when I was in undergrad and still now. It looks a little different now that I'm in medical school, actually, which is something I might talk about later. But what I find fascinating is, you know, it's not an easy fix, and it's, like you said, it's so counterproductive. And I wonder, there must be some sort of like evolutionary reason for having this sort of reaction to negative events, maybe to be more protective or to be less exploratory. You know, like in the face of threat, you probably want to take more comfort and like sleep in more and do less things. But it just seems ridiculous to me that in such a safe society and in such a safe environment that we haven't learned to just be better at like taking on these issues and realizing that there really aren't that many things that are out there to get us. Like, what threats are there really in this world that are really dangerous to us outside of our own mental state? Like depression, of course, it's in here, it's in your head, but it impacts us so heavily. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned that there are some external factors that also contribute to it, but I've actually never considered that. To be honest, like I never thought that, you know, shorter days and colder weather that would have such a big impact on me. But what I think when I think about depression is it's such an internal thing that it's so counterintuitive and so it feels like a fantasy. It feels unreal, and maybe that's why it's so hard to deal with for a lot of people, including myself. That it's hard to get a grasp on. So I'm glad to see you being able to delineate or point out exactly what are the causes and etiological agents, let's say, of depression. It's tough to do.
Yeah. And, you know, these kind of psychological qualitative states are very difficult to delineate, especially if you're in that state and you're observing from the state of depression, right? So you yourself become an unreliable observer for yourself. As for the biological evolutionary argument, I think it makes a lot of sense. So I won't dig too deep into it here, but I think there's a lot of evidence to support the case that depression and the symptoms of depression is very closely tied to inflammatory responses and an immune response. So I learned in my second year cell bio course when we were looking at these kind of issues, that inflammatory cytokines within your circulation actually, over the long term, down-regulate the number of dopaminergic neurons and receptors like within your motivation systems. So there's a really great link between infectious or external threat and that impulse to hide, seclude yourself, and kind of be miserable and do nothing. I think this makes a lot of sense for a number of reasons. So say you've injured yourself and acquired a very infectious disease. Then, well, first of all, you don't want to be around other people, and other people probably won't be likely to be around you. So if you could enter a psychological state where you just kind of seclude yourself on your own and do that, then that's great for the group, and for you as an individual as well. And I, but nowadays, you're right. Like, we don't have those obvious external threats, let's say, that would make this kind of depressive adaptation useful. And that's why that's part of the reason why it's so frustrating. you know why are so many people today depressed? Because it doesn't seem to be useful in any way. And it seems so, and you're right, it's so counterproductive. I mean, you said there's no really material, or at least immediately visible threats, but I think a huge one is isolation, or social isolation. And we've touched on this issue before, but I think really thinking about it more and more, the amount of energy nowadays that we have to expend um, in order to engage in genuine social activity, with people we can connect with people that we know and have histories with, and have what shared values and common rules of engaging and interaction with. Like, the energy that we have to expend is ridiculously high. Starting from transportation to overcoming every single person's different schedules, geographic locations, lifestyles, preferences. Like, I really do think there is a kind of epidemic there, and maybe that's one of the reasons why depression has become so prevalent. We feel more isolated and detached from one another.
Well, another thing that I have noted this past week and maybe the week before, especially because it's exam season for me now, so I'm a little more isolated and I'm seeing fewer people. But I've also realized that there's a sort of like settling amongst people. We sort of settle to be friends with people who we really don't like connect with, but at least connect with us on one or two superficial points that we still hang out with them. Like, for example, someone goes to the gym and you're like, okay, well, they're my gym buddy, I'll just get to know them this way. But in reality, you might not really connect with them at all, right? And so I think maybe there's an aspect of false hope to think that, okay, we just need to be more connected with other people. We just need to make more friends. We just need to see more people often, and that will solve the loneliness problem. But as we probably know already, just being around people isn't enough to solve that issue. So I think another barrier that we're facing is that we're not really connecting with the right people all the time, and that might be because we're not exposed to enough different people to get a sense of who we connect well with. I mean, you and I have been in school for a very long time, and that comes with it like a certain group of people, right? And there might be another totally different group that we've never ever connected with, never ever talked with, really, because we've never had the chance to. So I think there's definitely a barrier there, in the sense that it's the quality of the relationship that also matters, not just the quantity. And I really felt that this week, because I felt like I've really connected with one person that I didn't think I would ever. But the quality time that I spent with them has been like better than most of the times I spent with a whole bunch of other people over the past few months. So I've really felt that this week.
Like, can you tell us a bit more about like how that connection formed? What kind of traits maybe did you have in common other than the superficial traits, or how did that ball get rolling?
Well, one of the interesting things is that, well, first of all, we're both Korean, so that helps a lot. It turns out that your cultural values and your experiences growing up have a lot to do with how well you connect. And I didn't really recognize this very much. So for the last few years, considered myself as kind of white. Like I felt like I was whitewashed, and that I connected well with white people, and it's been an effort as well. Like I really wanted to fit in with the society here, and I really wanted to fit in with friends here, and there were some values that I thought were really nice to uphold. So I learned those values. I learned those mannerisms, and as you know, like a lot of my close friends are white. But this was like the first time when someone actually called me out and said, like, you're not white, you're Korean. Like don't pretend like you're something you're not. And that like threw me for a loop. I'm like, whoa, geez, like this, you're attacking my identity here. Like I've never thought about this. But when I really, really dug deep, I found that at the core, my central values are still very much Korean, and that the way I see things is very much Korean, and the way I see people is very much Korean. I could try to describe what that's like, but I'll need a little help to really, flesh that out. But after realizing this, the conversation that I had with this person just became so much more comfortable. Like I felt like I could be myself more, and that I could say things that I would never say to my white friends, to this person, and they just get it. Like they would just understand my perspective. So yeah, so that's the thing that really took me over the edge was me being called out, and me realizing that I am kind of putting up a front, and maybe a lot of people are as well, because they want to fit in, because they want to have friends. But really, the good quality relationships come from when you expose yourself fully for who you are, and hopefully that person who you really are is compatible with someone else out there.
Mm-hmm. Or that person who you really are resonates in some deep way with the person that the other person really is.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I wanted to bring up this example. You've heard of subtle Asian memes.
Subtle Asian traits.
Subtle Asian traits. Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Right. And so I think the page is less than a month old, and within like a month, it's grown exponentially, and now includes probably most of the young Asian, university-going population. I think it has more than 1 million followers.
I'm gonna look that out right now, but keep going.
And there was also a New York Times article written about subtle Asian traits. I don't know if you saw this.
I did, yeah. It's sitting at 945,000 right now.
Right, so very close to 1 million.
Soon. Yeah.
And it's, I'm sure if you combine the spin-off ones like subtle Asian dating, you exceed 1 million easily. And to me, it's such a crazy phenomenon, but you can really understand. It's really a case study of the kind of cultural tensions at work within our society, and the challenges in identity and navigating this very multicultural world that we live in. I think it's has a similar root to the concerns that like the political left has been trying to address, or to point out that there are real, let's say, issues in the dynamics of race and culture and identity within our culture. And I think more and more I'm realizing that the critique of the left, although it's been misdirected at times, was really pointing at something genuine and real that was going on, especially within our generation. And so back to the subtle Asian traits, and the New York Times article, it put a lot of these same things out. These memes are like little fragments of culture, of comments that maybe all Asian Americans or Koreans or Chinese or Japanese or Taiwanese or wherever, Filipino, whatever your background, that we, or a specific group, share common like childhood memories, or or just the kind of foods that we grew up eating,
Mm.
or the way that our parents would treat us in certain situations. Like we don't realize it, but there are so many of those micro, every day-to-day experiences that have shaped who we are, our values, and the way we operate in the world. And that's so deeply ingrained within us. And I feel as though subtle Asian traits has been kind of like a pressure valve for those connections that were not being formed to kind of suddenly explode onto the um, and it really became a kind of like a safe space for people to connect. And I, I think it's a team of maybe like 10-ish university students in Australia who are kind of monitoring these memes and pages. And I think they've done a really great job in moderating the page, in kind of looking out for overtly racist content, and but still not being too restrictive. So yeah, no, there's so much to say here about culture and the way we relate to one another, our identities. That you could spend like maybe 5 podcasts talking about. But
It's a big topic, yeah.
but culture is something that's been on my mind for a very long time.
Let's talk about it. So I watched Crazy Rich Asians too, very recently, actually, a couple weeks back, and I really enjoyed it. I didn't think I'd enjoy it, to be honest. Like I thought it was just going to be like another, like those cheap flicks where they talk about like superficial issues and that don't really matter. I mean, well, what it did was it presented a lot of struggles that Asians face, um, in the big screen, in the Hollywood scene, right? So the tie to family and the importance of your roots and your culture, and like familial infighting, that kind of stuff. Like that's pretty big in Asian culture, I find, not just the Chinese culture, but also in Korean culture as well. So I thought they handled that well, and I was very pleased with it. But one of the questions that I had really, and I don't think I asked my friends this, there were like two. So we watched this as a house, and there's like two white people, and then there's like two Asians. I never asked them like how they what they thought about the movie and how much they clicked with it, because I'm sure elements of this also exist in Western cultures and white cultures, but I'm assuming at a different magnitude, right? I think it's a lot stronger in Asian cultures. And one thing I wanted to mention also is that in the movie they made them crazy rich, I think, to make it more accessible to white viewers, because it makes more sense. Okay, they have a lot of money, so family is very important. Like social standing is very important. But they could have been crazy poor Asians, and a lot of the similar there would be a lot of the similar cultural values that were at stake and conflicts that arise. Maybe not to the same magnitude, but still very much prevalent. So I don't know if you watched it. Maybe I should have started with that, but it's definitely a recommended movie for me.
Yeah, no, it's been a pretty long time since I watched Crazy Rich
Okay.
Asians. But I agree with most of the sentiments. The one thing about it could have been Crazy Poor Asians. I mean, it was based off a book. I don't
Right.
exactly
Okay.
know the intentions for. Yeah, I don't know how well a book called Crazy Poor Asians would sell. I don't know. Maybe it would be a bestseller now as a spin-off to Crazy Rich Asians. But yeah, I think my parents also saw it. I don't know if they ever go to the movies for anything, to watch anything, but they went and saw Crazy Rich Asians. And my dad, afterwards watching it, he was like, "Oh, that was all right. It was like seeing a Korean drama, but like in a movie form." So he was like not that impressed. But I think that speaks to the you're right. There's that dynamic of relationships, um, that and dynamic and tensions of relationships and values that happen within the, let's say, Asian familial drama that's replayed and represented over and over, so much so that it's stereotyped in Korean dramas and Asian dramas, like that kind of hostile mother-in-law, the rich the rich secret CEO meeting the less well-off girl.
Yeah.
And it's a theme that captures Asian audiences. And you're right, I'm not really sure how people with different cultural backgrounds and different exposure to narratives kind of respond to those, or how much they can relate to it. My guess would be that, yeah, at a superficial level, but maybe not to the same point of joy. There's one other thing I wanted to mention about the film. When Black Panther came out, it was kind of heralded as this glowing success for representation of Black culture on Hollywood screen. And at the time, I didn't really know what to make of it. A part of me thought, is race the most important thing? Why should we make such a big deal of this? Aren't we increasing tensions and furthering the gap with between races and cultures? But then I saw Crazy Rich Asians, and one part of the movie that struck with me the most was when Ken Jeong first kind of popped up on the screen as this kind of fat, funny dad, ridiculous dad. And at that moment, I was like, holy shit, it's Ken Jeong. I love Ken Jeong. He's literally a Korean doctor turned comedian doing what he wants to do. Like, that's my dream. So, I can think whatever I want about, representation and like racial tensions, whatever in my brain, but my body responds differently. Like it responds viscerally, like, oh my God, a Korean dude. Wow. Like I'm so proud. I'm so happy that he's there and I get to see him. And yeah, so that's an aspect that definitely can't be ignored. The fact that our cultures and our identities within our cultures are very important, and that it facilitates, it lowers the activation energy for people to connect and live alongside each other, right? Having that shared culture. So, that's really important. But, one big question and problem that we face up against day to day now is, okay, so how should we proceed? Should we just all immigrate back to Korea and build a great Korean nation?
You could, yeah.
Do we build pockets
next week? What's your schedule like next week?
Yeah, I will book a flight.
Okay, great.
Should we live in pockets of communities? How should integration happen? To what degree? At what pace? These are very difficult questions to answer. And I think one of the misassumptions of multiculturalism, let's say, is that we can build our own culture from scratch, right? That you can build a common culture across literally people who have been living separately for 99% of human history and have developed totally different foods, ways, mannerisms, sports, cultural rituals, activities, timelines, like you name it, like that are different in so many manners, like so much so that like our skin has adapted, with different wholly different pigmentation for it, the assumption is, the ridiculous assumption is that, okay, you can kind of create this blanket culture that will kind of accommodate everyone, and it'll be a great multicultural society, and everyone will respect each other and everyone will learn from each other and it'll be a great time. But I think in our day-to-day lives we're coming up with the struggles and challenges, and to a degree, I can relate to, when figures on the left say things like minority groups are being marginalized, or I think they're speaking from lived experience and other people's lived experience of feeling like an outsider, feeling like being on the margins of a culture and not really having an identity. And that's a very painful thing, not to have an identity and a sense of who you want to be, who your friends are, what you like. So more and more, I'm growing to understand the kind of sentiments and pains that like people in our generation and generations before us have probably been going through.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you bring that up, because I want to make a point, because I guess in the past few years, I've been one of those people who almost look down on people who can't integrate into society, right? So I feel terrible about it, but I think the gut reaction for me whenever there was someone who complained about lack of representation of Asians, or like the hypersexualization of Asian females, which is something that I think a close friend of ours actually talked about before. When I see that, like, the gut reaction is to say, okay, well, what's the big deal? Like, why are you making this an issue? Aren't you, as you said, like pulling us apart? Aren't you like worsening that tie that we're trying to make between, us minority groups and the dominant culture here? And it's interesting, because I feel like that is sort of a learned response, and maybe I don't know if it came from a bad place or a good place, but I think it's taught to us that way. And a part of it is what you mentioned, the idea of multiculturalism. And I remember even in like grade 4 or 5, we learn in social sciences class about the term multiculturalism and the mosaic and the melting pot and all of that. And we're taught to believe, okay, well, this Canada is I think it's a mosaic, right? I think America was the melting pot, but we're taught this way, and then we sort of buy into it, and we're like, oh yeah, like, as kids, we're like, oh yeah, we'll accept anything. Like, we'll be fine. Like, culture's not a huge deal. And then you grow up, and then you have more experiences, and all of a sudden, you realize that there are things that don't click, that don't make sense to you, and it's because you're from a different culture. So I'm wondering, like, you posed this question, I think, in the very beginning: how do we move forward? And I personally, I don't like complaining about it. I really don't. I mean, I don't know how to get that out of me, but I don't like to be the one to say, hey, like, where's my representation? Where are all the Asians in medicine? I'm sure there's a lot, because but like, where are the Asians in blank blank blank? Where's things like that? Like, that can't be the best way to do it. So what do we do, June? Tell me. give us a 100-word plan of action.
Well, I don't know about 100 words, but the first step is a little bit of elimination. And so you identify the solutions that don't work, that will,
Okay.
in our estimation, that won't work.
Okay, let's try it.
One example is, I think you brought up, the example of needing equal representation. I think one of the assumptions is that that Asians as a minority group, or any other minority group, can gain more respect or proper integration if only there were more political power and representation to support that. And that's a fine hypothesis and to make. And I think in certain situations that can be true. So, for example, let's say this. So you have these really brilliant filmmakers who are from Asian descent, and if you have Asian representation among those group of elite filmmakers, then you can get a film like Crazy Rich Asians.
Mm-hmm.
and maybe the general public perception on Asians can shift a little bit because we're very sensitive to what we are exposed to and see on media. Sure, like I would buy that argument, and I would argue that that's like a net positive for the overall culture. In terms of defining quotas or like percentile based representation rules for, let's say, political parties or board of governors or board of directors for a company. Like, I think that's when it gets a little irrational, because that's a fine hypothesis to test out, but I don't think enforcing those rules, well, it can solve one problem but create a whole host of other problems. One of the main ones being the problem of competence. So if there is someone who is more, like, quote unquote, qualified for the job, and you take one board of director, let's say, just because of their Asianness, because they have to enforce the quota, then you can end up in suboptimal situations, and you might further the racial tension, let's say, between the board of directors. So
I want to, okay, before you continue, I want to bring this up because this is like the affirmative action sort of deal that we're talking about, right? And I know some people that we've looked up, like, talk about competence and equality of opportunity as opposed to equality of outcome. But one of the things that I think needs to be sort of unpacked a little is that idea of competence. So if we're saying that competence is, let's say in politics, the competence to make decisions that are going to be best for the people, right? Would you not say a part of that competence is being able to understand and appreciate the problems that the people are experiencing? In which case, you could argue that you need Asian people in politics because they're the only ones that can really understand the Asian experience.
Yeah, and that's a very strong argument to make, and I think that's for the most part true. And then the question is, okay, if we take that to be true, how do you introduce competent people who are competent because of their other competencies and because also of their lived experience? How do you introduce those people into the positions of power? And I think the idea of setting a quota has a little bit of wishful thinking embedded into it. The reason I say that is because, the reason I say that is, I think the quota and percentile idea and like affirmative action ideas come from generally a good place. Like all those issues that we talked about so far and wanting to address them. But I think it's too radical and too quick. It's sort of like wishing that there would be a quick Band-Aid solution to this incredibly deep and complex problem, of which there are multiple, compounding and networked factors.
Right.
A lot of these issues we've kind of explored over the years. It's not only tensions in culture and race that we're having. It's tensions in religion and spirituality, and basically our entire approach to how we should live, like who we are as humanity and where we should go going forwards. Like, these are incredibly like fundamental questions that these kind of more surface level manifestations are tied in with. At least that's what I believe. That's what I believe about the culture, like the state of the culture right now. So the idea that you can have a quick Band-Aid solution like that to kind of cover up these underlying pains is a ridiculous idea. But at the same time, like, I would understand the motivations of, of wanting that kind of quick and radical change, because the pains that motivate it are equally as deep and deep and painful. So you know, it's really difficult and tricky solution to solve, and I don't think a top-down simple solution is going to cut it.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking that as you were formulating that too, like it's sort of cutting corners, right? But okay, so there's two sides to this. I think the first side is okay, maybe it'll work regardless of how quick and easy it is, and I don't know if either of us can comment on this at the moment, but I guess there's been some history, like affirmative action and steps like that have been taken, and we can look at the evidence and see if it's actually worked. Um, that's one thing that I wanted to point out, and the second thing I think is very much in agreement with what you've been saying, and maybe the real solution is to let these kind of things um, form naturally. You know, you'd hope that an Asian politician would come out naturally through, you know, just how things progressed, such that they are competent and that they can represent the Asian people, and they would be put into higher status, higher positions of power, and that would be the ideal solution, right? And I think there's so many like hidden things that you alluded to. And one of the things I know is I don't know any Asian around me that has had a strong interest in politics outside of maybe the realm that the field that they're studying in. So I know like some Asians who want to go into like health policy, but no one has really, no one around me anyway has talked about, okay, well, I want to be the next mayor. I want to be the next, you know, premier of Ontario. Um, and so that either hints at the fact that, you know, maybe Asians as a whole aren't necessarily interested in something like this. Maybe it's not something that we're invested in. And I think that holds true. I think different cultures put different emphasis on different occupations and different ways of living, essentially. Or maybe the opposite is true. Maybe it's that we're being squashed, we're being quelled. Um, I can't reliably say. I think there's maybe a balance between the two, as there usually is. There's a lot of strengths, and I think in Asian culture with like mathematics or the sciences and things like that. So we're more naturally inclined to pursue those, and the people around us say, "Oh, you're good at this. Why don't you keep pursuing it and continue on forward?" So there's a bit of that reinforcement. So all of this is to say that I agree with you. I think that simple solution of just increasing quota, that's problematic, and it's kind of lazy. And we're probably going to see the repercussions of that very soon. But yeah, how else do we move forward?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to go through maybe one scenario.
Sure.
And then I can address. We'll try to address that problem afterwards. So the scenario I want to bring up is, I think last week, my first, so Medical Foundations 1, so our last semesters, let's say, learning group, got together and had dinner with our tutors.
Okay.
So these are the like physicians who kind of facilitate our discussion and learning within our group classes. And one of them, like I won't name him, but like he was talking about these kind of same issues because they had a board meeting about it, about diversity, inclusivity, and equity, with very, you know, with the high ranking position people in that department. And, you know, we're talking about a lot of the similar issues, but one thing that he pointed out was that when you get to those ladders of very high leadership at an organizational level, the decisions about like who gets to lead what is usually done on a fairly informal basis by, let's say, you know, the president or something, and appointing almost in a nepotistic way. Like if you're cynical, you could see it that way, but if you're just speaking more based on the reality of the situation, you could say, well, like obviously you're going to hire people who you have some connection to, who you kind of know will do the right job, and that who you kind of know also are going to get along in the culture of the people that are there. So I was thinking about that, and I think a lot of that is true, and it may even be like you can make a case that having similar, let's say, kind of cherry-picked people from within your own network to form that leadership group may lead to a more stable and like well-functioning leadership group, let's say. Because I think there's a lot of things that go into like, I'll be very generous and like try not to be cynical about this. Um, you know, let's say you have a board of directors again for a company, and they help, run, kind of run the operations, and they kind of have their own like elite social circle. And there's, a number of things that they like to do and get together and network. So a big thing is golf. They play golf in, local or exotic locations. They might like hosting dinner parties at, their places, and some kind of fancy, like, I don't know, French or like English or some kind of European cuisine. Appetizers, like usually, they might go to like Western style concert to get together and relate to one another. And they have all these kind of micro facets of culture that they all share that allow them to function well as a group, let's say. And one angle you could take at that is to say, like, if you were being cynical about it, is like, oh my God, like there's a group of, ridiculous old white men who are running this entire thing and are being exclusive and marginalizing people, not letting other people come into the rings of leadership. Okay, what's the alternative? Let's say like you have this, let's say maybe in 50 years, let's say I went back to Korea and lived there for 50 years, and like, I come back and there's me and there's this other dude. There's June Park and John Doe. John Doe plays golf, goes to the cottage with his kids, like has all those kind of features that make him click well with the current board of directors. And then you have June Park. Since he's gone to Korea, like he always bows every time instead of shaking hands. He wears kind of like sort of different clothes and different brands. And the way I like relate to other executives is like, I don't know, I'll go to karaoke with them and then drink. So as competent as I may be, I might not be the best fit for the company culture, right? Because that's, could be considered an integral part of like the company's function. So, I think you can make the case, this is a very generous example and like non-cynical one, that like that kind of cultural segregation and let's say marginalization doesn't happen always out of like intense racism. It doesn't always happen out of wanting to marginalize and exclude others, but it's a natural bottom-up process that, when seen from a different angle, can seem like a bunch of old, powerful white men who are controlling and being exclusive and marginalizing, any bad words you want to toss at them, to other people. So that's kind of a that's kind of a thought experiment I've been toying around with, like the actual reality of it, and how generous I can be with the interpretation. That might not always apply in all cases. It's very complex, but yeah, I just wanted to share that kind of thought experiment.
That really hits with me a lot. Like imagine you're like 60 and you've worked so hard to get this position, and you're comfortable where you are, and then some random dude comes in like into your workplace, and you know he's totally different. He doesn't. You talk to him and you don't get the answers you expect. He talks about some other stuff, and you know he behaves differently. Like you're not going to want to spend the time to like understand this person and incorporate them in. Like it's going to be so difficult, especially when you're
at
that
that
age.
age of 60, you probably won't be able to understand.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're gonna have new memes by then, and if they try to talk to you in like these new surreal memes, you're not gonna understand what's going on. So, and you're not even gonna want to. Like when I'm 60, I'm gonna be sick of all your shit. You know, like I'm gonna be sick of this world. I know it. So by then, like I hope I have enough of status to be able to do just that. But anyway, that's how I feel as well. And so I guess like one way we could do it is we ourselves could get to those positions and then maybe try to be more accommodating, more welcoming, and try to support that because you know little things. You know, you take that group of old white men to like a sushi restaurant. That's like day one. You know, like who doesn't like that? And then day two, you know, you try to experiment a little more. You know, give them some like Korean alcohol, some soju. You take them out for dinner, and then the third night, you know, you show them one video of K-pop and make sure it's a good one. It's maybe they like the Korean girls dancing up on stage and they get some sort of new exotic fascination surrounding that. And baby steps, right? But um, it's a difficult issue for sure. Uh, and yeah, I think it's something that we can probably grapple with all our lives and maybe make an impact. I don't know, but I'm glad to have recognized it more now than before, because now I feel like I could be a lot more truer to myself. Like I don't have to like convince myself that I'm white. You know, there's a part of me that is, I think, that upholds those values, but deep inside,
Mhm.
you know, still a Korean. So
Yeah.
gotta represent.
Yeah. Um, I think one of the things that, you know, in terms of solutions going forward, like you laid out a like sort of idealistic scenario, and I'm sure that can happen to some degree. I'm sure it can like combine between the cultures a little bit. But in terms of solutions, um, one of the things I think you might have to be a little more careful of. It's strange because it's so intuitive to us, like saying like white people and white culture.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think everyone knows what we talk about when we say like that,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, there's this kind of pattern of, let's say, dominant culture, for lack of a better word. Um, Maybe it's yeah, more like the commercial, materialistic, you know, Western culture. You know, we can't say that every time in a sentence, so we just say white culture or like white people. And I think it's fine. I think it gets the point across. But there's a danger of that becoming what uh, too much of a shortcut,
Mm-hmm.
um, and
Us
that
and them.
that developing into kind of tribal and hostile relations.
Yeah,
So,
I see what you mean. That's a good point.
yeah, it's so difficult to regulate, you know, within yourself and to watch for. But I don't really have better language to encapsulate those ideas at the moment. And people seem to respond favorably and well, you know, when you make those kind of jokes, like, you know, when you talk about white people or
Yeah,
those kind of things. Um,
it's guilt.
yeah, no, it's
It's a bit of
or,
guilt.
or like you know, just saying like white privilege in like a kind of jokey way, like
Yeah.
it's I think there's a lot of tension there, but a lot of tension to be released as well. So like if you can do it in a spirit of, you know, of play and respectful engagement that comes from a place of, you know, like love and respect, it can go well. But you know, if you see elements of hostility, or jealousy, or other things being introduced in your psyche as you say those things, then maybe you should watch out. You know, maybe you should be careful. So that's one thing I might be mindful of. In terms of other solutions, yeah, like I really do think the kind of cultural challenges and many of the existential threats that humanity faces from now on, um, is like, if there's any solutions that are generated to that, it's going to come from the bottom up. So it's going to happen more organically and not as a result of top-down tinkering and manipulation and political gerrymandering, whatever. Because like I've said in some previous episodes, I think we're at the cusp of a major revolutionary shift in our consciousness and the way we perceive and act and interact in the world. And I think that's going to be brought about, because of these challenges, because of new and coming technologies that are so incredibly powerful, like psychotechnologies, like psychedelics, AI, blockchain. A lot of people describe it as the fourth industrial revolution, but I think there's going to be more. So I think we're at the cusp of very big changes, and maybe in our lifetime we'll get to see some of them. But all this to say is that navigating through this process might be very rocky and difficult, but it's imperative for all individuals to not want easy top-down fixes. It's imperative to get to know your own identity, to discover things that really drive you and make you feel alive, and map that with the challenges that yourself and other people are facing. I think this conversation is a result of that process. We were really digging in and looking in at our identities and our internal struggles, and we saw that those internal struggles mapped on perfectly to the cultural struggles that we're facing. So this process of individual growth and development is not only for us, it's also for the challenges in culture and society. And so I think that focus on the organic, natural bottom-up development process, and a focus on the individual, ourselves, our own identities and motivations, is really going to serve us in the long term.
And what a great way to end it off. So thank you everyone for listening. Last comments. I think, I love individual responsibility. I think one thing that we can do is raise awareness or keep the conversation going. If people don't know, these kind of things are happening from the bottom up, then, we're not going to get very good results. So it's probably good to keep the conversations going and hopefully, send this message on to other people who might have doubts, like me, like me 3 weeks ago. So I'm really glad that came up so that we could have this great conversation. So thank you for sharing, and thank you, listeners. All right, I'll end it off there. Signing off.